All right, so we're gonna look at a couple of slides here. One's gonna be on the presidency of Manuel Avila Camacho. He follows um, the most popular recent president, Lazaro Cardenas, and in fact, Cardenas is going to have subsequent importance throughout Mexican politics for the next couple of decades. So he's someone that just, you see his years up to 1970. He's someone that doesn't go anywhere. And in fact, will be Avila's, Camacho's um, Secretary of War during World War II. So Camacho's presidency is known as a time of some stability. Um, in fact, he's known for one creating the social security system in Mexico. It's also under him that the PRI is actually finally gets its name, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, and so you're seeing more and more the stability of institutional Mexican politics taking root. Decades later from all the chaos of the Mexican Revolution. So those are just two examples of his presidency. Um, the other thing in both Cardenas and Camacho's presidency is, um, frankly, the war, the effect of the war. Mexico actually had a rising fascist groups or different groups in Mexico. At the same time, also having people that saw the Soviet Union as the great socialist experiment. So I mean, you had that kind of two roads in different political persuasions in Mexico. Um, and Cardenas and Camacho to some extent are progressive in their understanding of Mexican politics, um, and within some ways maybe Camacho going slowing down some of Cardenas' more progressive ideas, or at least sentiments, I guess you could say. Um, so the war kind of types this up, um, and before you know it, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor and then the subsequent sinking of two Mexican oil tankers off the coast of Florida by the Germans, this propels Mexico to declare war on the Axis powers and to become allied to the United States. So this inevitably repairs relations with the United States, and it's just kind of something that sort of fits. If you think of FDR and his good neighbor program, and the way he was trying to reach out in a more benevolent fashion towards Latin America, then you can see this with the presidency of Camacho with FDR. Um, so Mexico's not get that busy in the war effort. I mean, they're not really adept to join in. The most involvement they have is the 201st Squadron. It does take a part in some missions, particularly in the Pacific, Japan, Philippines, I believe, and these are planes from the United States. So, but this does signal one example of repaired relations with the United States. And in general, even subsequent years, all the way to recent years, the relationship with Mexico is never as toxic as it's going to get with other Latin American countries. Um, Probably the most famous legacy is the Bracero program, that was set up between the United States and Mexico, and this is a sort of rough spot, and yet it's also one that illustrates an opportunity. You know, there has so on the one hand where some would attack the program as taking advantage of the hole in American workforce because of the war, right? So many people going off to fight the war. Now you have Mexican farmers going in and join into the workforce. And we're talking with over the length of the program. We're talking about 22 years. Initially, it was supposed to be a 4-year program, but it goes to about 64. So about 22 years, and probably around 4.5 million braceros who crossed the border to work in the United States. And that's only those that went officially. You do have some who are going to cross, don't want to deal with the red tape, and are going to cross over. Um, if you look at the year 64, this is around the same time period the UFW and the Cesar Chavez movement really takes hold. So, and that story is a sticky subject as more and more historians look at it. I would say more in a global understanding. Some of the internal conflict between the UFW and that union versus other Mexican labor. It is. I think it deserves further looking into by historians, pointing out some of the kind of abusive language coming from the UFW and Chavez in particular. So that is something that needs to be studied a lot more, honestly. And if the few really interesting articles that came out recently that if you're interested, I could point you out to. But whereas the employers, there are some obviously issues between the employers and the braceros in general. From the accounts from braceros, many of them utilize this as an opportunity. So it is there's a quote in a recent textbook where the author Terry Rugley says, "quote Seldom has a program so universally reviled been so popular among its purported victims." End quote. So that kind of tells you something about of that issue. All right. When we look at the next presidency, we'll see this big transition period, and we'll start moving towards basically the showdown between the students and the government in the late 60s. Before we do that, I wanted to quickly talk about Mexican philosophy. So, philosophy in the early 20th century Mexico is frankly dealing with two things. One, the scientificos, the positivism of late 19th century Mexican politics and philosophy during the reign of Porfirio Diaz, and also the idealization of the 19th century French social political philosophical model, which, somewhat connected to Comte's positivism. So the first part where you kind of see this pushback against the positivist is at the El Ateneo de la Juventud, this school of philosophers and intellectuals. This is where the beginning of a number of like conferences and meetings would happen around the time of the revolution, where they're pushing back anything Porfirio Diaz. So that's going on in the early 20th century. Many of the philosophers that follow, not directly involved. I mean, Vasconcelos has some involvement in fighting, but particularly in government. I mean, he's kind of in and out. He's chosen by Oregon as education czar, and is really, really, really influential in pushing for this new push on education. Um, and then he would try to become president in 29. He loses to Calles' people, and that's where Calles sort of begins to play around with the election laws. will leave, come back. In the later years, he sort of becomes a fascist. So he's kind of all over the place, and in one ways, probably the most famous Mexican philosopher, but probably also most controversial. So the quick aside, Octavio Paz is known as more of an essayist and not philosopher, even though he wields a lot of influence. But that's probably the next guy who's probably most famous out of these thinkers. All right, Vasconcelos is important because he wrote the La Raza Cosmica, this very speculative metaphysical track on the mestizo as like this superior is not the right word, but almost like this savior race, So some of this kind of connects back to Comtean positivism, or even the eugenics that was in the air, and trying to answer more of the kind of racist eugenics that was out there in the earliest 20th century. So I guess in some sense he was trying to make a case for quote unquote Hispanic America and the mestizo in Mexico. But by doing this, in some ways, he elevates the mestizo over other types of identity and ethnicity in Mexico, in particular, via education. So that's what I'm saying. It's a weird text, but it just has a huge impact in Mexico and across Latin America, and even uh, Latinx in the United States, as they explore some of these themes. The next philosopher to look at is, well, just briefly, is Antonio Caso. Now, Caso dates back earlier, and Caso is very anti-positivist. I mean, he's anti-positivist to the bone. He wants to turn Mexico's philosophy towards kind of a combination of humanism, so a focus on the humanities, literature, philosophy, education. But he does think there's a morality problem in Mexico, and this stems from, again, from as far back as the chaos of the revolution, but even the promotion of a more democratic Mexico. And so he leans more on kind of the Western Christian tradition, and what he would set out as more of a moral Christian, what he called cosmovision. So that's Caso's focus. And again, he has a really huge influence on the next generation of philosophers, especially in the anti-positivism of people like Ramos and others. Kind of goes back to Caso. And in some sense, the retrieval of other strands of Western philosophy. Now, when Ramos pops up, Ramos definitely shows influence of the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset. And Ortega y Gasset is probably the most famous Spanish philosopher in the 20th century. Even though he doesn't get exiled to Mexico like many Spanish philosophers and educators and intellectuals in general had done, because of Franco, the fascist, winning the Spanish Civil War in Mexico with the help of Mussolini and Hitler. So you have this kind of brain drain in Spain, and Latin America, and Mexico in particular, is able to take in a lot of these Spanish intellectuals. And so that really does spur Mexican philosophy, and in particular, the influence of Ortega y Gasset on just Latin American philosophy. And this is kind of the foundation to Ramos, because Ortega y Gasset is sort of historical, a philosopher of history. So he's looking at very entrenched history. And so this leads Ramos to really focus on the, quote, psychological study of the Mexican human being. So he focused on the national philosophy. What does it mean to have a Mexican philosophy? What does it mean to produce Mexican culture? So thus, profile of man and culture in Mexico, right? So that's what the book is about. It's doing this in a non-positivist way, and much like a lot of Latin American philosophers who all of a sudden have all these Spanish philosophers in their midst. They're asking, why is Latin American philosophy suffering from inferiority complex?